So we'll open with a few questions for the panelists, and given the nature of the topic, I think it would be very good to have a very interactive discussion with questions. So we'll try to open the floor as soon as possible. So I wanted to give a couple of questions first to Gary and to Wayne, and sort of let them do their opening statement. But I want to frame the questions around these two topics. One is whether you think that a notion of self is essential, fundamental, in order to improve or to have a quantum leap in cognitive systems, or it's just something that maybe an epiphenomenon or something that evolution found necessary but we can dispense with. And more generally, I want also to expand on the more general idea of what is that neuroscience can provide, can teach cognitive systems, if anything at all. So, Gary, if you want.
Wow, those are two big and different questions. I actually think the first one is maybe not that hard. I think that self is optional for an awful lot of things. And there's so much that we haven't figured out how to do in AI that is yet to explore, where self is probably not that important. So, for example, in natural language understanding, we still have a really long way to go. I mean, just because I can ask my phone for movie directions doesn't mean that my phone really understands what I'm talking about in any general kind of way. And it's not clear that the phone needs to have a representation of itself other than to know that it gets asked questions and so forth, but in a pretty minimal way in order to do a much better job. I'm probably more interested in the machine having a representation of me and my desires and my preferences and so forth. And I think it's possible for a machine to do that without having any special representation of itself. There's a narrow way in which my phone already has a representation of itself. Like, it has accelerometers, so it knows about its orientation, and it's got speakers and cameras and so forth. So in terms of having like some sensory representations of its position in place, in space, we already have that. And I'm not sure that's the critical thing for at least, let's say, the next 20 years of AI. I wouldn't even want to try to project where AI will be 50 years from now. I mean, will we really have characters, avatars like in the movie Her 50 years from now? It's possible. But a lot of what might look to us like self might be illusion. There's already, I think, a Microsoft product called Xiaoice or something like that in China that tens of millions or something like that of people interact with. It's actually not hard to fool a human being into thinking that a machine has a self. That's a different question from the machine actually having a self. So I would say self-optional, at least for the next decades. Maybe Wayne wants to weigh in on that, and then we could talk about neuroscience.
Yes.
Okay, well, my past self was sitting in the audience listening to your talk, and it was wondering what my future self was going to say when it got up there on the stage and had to say something, which is very interesting because the future self is here now, I suppose. I guess I think in terms of cognitive systems more so than selves, at least in terms of my research and probably my personal life. I mean, if you were to ask me if I know the time, I would say, yeah, it's 2:33, looking at my watch. And what sense did I know the time? If I didn't have a watch, you say, did I know the time? I said, well, let's see. It's probably about 2:30, 3 o'clock, something like that. And I would come up with an answer. My cognitive system would find an answer for you. And I'd be very happy taking both of those things and saying, yes, I knew the time. So in that sense, at least, myself is very extensible to the sorts of cognitive systems which people have been talking about here. If you use your computer every day and somebody says, do you know the dean's phone number, Wayne? I said, oh, sure I do. And I'll go click on my address book and read them off the phone number. So these things become an extension of ourselves, and we're very comfortable thinking of them that way. These pathological cases are things I have, fortunately, no direct experience with, at least personally. So it's harder to have an opinion what those would be.
I like the rubber band case, rubber hand, excuse me, case that you talked about. It's a case where you can kind of imagine what the cognitive system might be doing in terms of basically calibrating different kinds of input data with one another. So you're doing cross-modal mappings, basically.
It's weighting vision over touch and saying, vision is more important for humans, and that's the thing to believe.
Right, and there are a whole bunch of systems in the brain that are about calibration and about conflict. So you can think about binocular rivalry when your two eyes are seeing something slightly different. And so it's of a piece with those kinds of things. That piece seems approachable, and it seems like if you want to build into a robot a system that calibrates, well, actually we have that. So we have SLAM, that's simultaneous location and mapping, and we're trying to integrate possibly incomplete information. So that piece of self seems approachable from the AI perspective. And then there's something that's more abstract about like knowing who I am that we don't know how to get.
I mean, I think the point to also make is that the self doesn't need to be self-conscious. So self just means a system that has a boundary with the other and is somehow aware of that boundary, not necessarily in a self-conscious way. Just like a phone. I mean, a phone has a physical boundary, so there is some implicit self versus other already built into it. And all systems are going to have that. The bigger question is really, does the AI become aware of itself having a self? Now that's sort of a second order, higher order problem. And you can imagine robots having a self in the sense that there is a self model, that there is a representation of what the robot is in the control system of the robot, and it's aware of its boundaries with others, but not in a self-conscious way, but in a very mechanistic way.
A good example of that is a self-driving car, presumably has the first in spades. It knows what its boundaries are, and it's trying to make sure its boundaries don't overlap some other creature's boundaries, but that doesn't mean that it has to have this sort of second-level sentience that you're talking about.
Now, Anil, we talked about this the last couple of days, but you didn't stress it enough in this presentation. That is, the self, the embodied self, is related to a value system and emotion, right? For us, the connection between body and emotion is very strong. So how do you see emotion playing a role here? Because presumably the self-driving car doesn't have emotions or
It needs values, though.
Yeah,
it has some values.
You have to build in those values. For us, our values of what our emotions mean to us are evolutionarily programmed in. So the fact that we are trying to survive, in a very physiological sense, means that certain emotions have a certain valence, other emotions have a different valence, and we act on those emotions. So that kind of value system will either have to be discovered by the AI system, which means, we were talking about this earlier too, is you have to let these AI systems sort of fight it out and figure out what is important. And I don't know how you would do that. But the other option is to actually program some of these value systems into the system that we're building so that it then has appropriate responses to its emotional state, whatever that might be.
So certainly in our lab, some of the studies we've done have been called by us and other people as looking at embodied cognition. And when we look at the trade-offs people make reflexively without thinking, we're equally likely, like my example of the watch, to rely upon memories or rely upon direct perception and use that information, use a memory retrieval or get information from the world just very seamlessly. And we're very comfortable doing that automatically. So, some of your examples, like lying on the table, looking at you, looking at yourself, that sort of sensation, it certainly makes sense if we're wired to, say, take the shortest path to getting the information we need. If all of a sudden that path is somehow short-circuited and the information is coming out of an unusual order, we will try to make sense of that and interpret it in ways we're used to interpreting it. So that much seems fairly reasonable from a cognitive perspective.
Did you want to get back to the neuroscience question?
Yeah, so
we never got to your second question.
Let me say this. I'd like you to address that, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Okay? But let me frame it in this way. So, in fact, we talked about this yesterday. Neuroscience is a very large area, And there is a group of people trying to extract information from reconstructing the detailed structure of neuronal connectivity throughout the entire brain in the hope that that will provide some insights for cognitive system. There is sort of another extreme, and this idea that the only thing that really matters is the cortex, right? And as we know, it's only a part of the brain, and there are tons of subcortical structures. In fact, we were talking about emotion. Some of them are very important for emotion. And then there is, Wayne and Gray are doing that is more, to some extent, more focused on cognitive aspects. So how do you see that? In what area, in what level of abstraction should we concentrate our efforts to make any headway into bringing information relevant to cognitive systems?
Well, I mean, let me preface this as a cognitive scientist. And I love that RPI has a cognitive science department. Most universities don't. There's both a cognitive science approach here and there's a neuroscience approach here. I think the question is, what can we learn from the human mind and brain to better inform our AI? So there's lots of things, even though AI is getting a lot of press now and it's obviously making progress, lots of things we still can't do. So we don't have AI systems that can reason at the level of human beings or understand language at the level of human beings, even though they're much better at doing sort of sheer computation, calculation, and so forth. And so can we look to humans for clues? And I think the answer probably is yes. And then there's two possible sources that ultimately cash out into the same thing, but you think about differently. One is like, can we look at the neural circuitry? Can we look at a connectome, for example, the individual neurons and how they're connected with one another and inform AI? There's a lot of talk in AI about neurally inspired AI, but none of it's really directly inspired by the particular circuits. In general, we don't know what those circuits are. And then there's AI, at least in principle, that could be inspired by better understanding the cognitive systems, by trying to understand the cognitive processes. My own bet is in the short term, we actually have a better chance there. So take common sense reasoning, how I know that if he lifted up his arm and went whoosh like this, he might knock that bottle over. Like, you could build a physical simulation of every particle in this room. But rather than doing that, Anil has wisely chosen to pick up his bottle, predicting from relatively sparse data the likely outcome if I were to swing my arm across the room, and he's taken measures to do it. So we have some approaches to do that, like the particle simulation, but there are shortcuts that the human mind is able to take that we might be able to understand at a cognitive process level that might be really useful for robotics. And then you look at the neural level. Well, we have a lot of connectome data forthcoming, like from the Allen Brain Institute, where I'm a consultant. And pretty soon we'll have at least like a millimeter by a millimeter by a millimeter of mouse tissue. We'll have a very detailed reconstruction, at least of where the neurons are. But probably that won't, in the short term, yield that much fruit. So it probably matters not only where all the neurons are, but what kinds of neurons there are, what kinds of proteins are expressed in each individual neuron. And so the level of data that we need is probably orders of magnitude more than we can currently collect. And then we don't know how to collect that in living human tissue for the most part yet. And so it may be a long time, I think, before neuroscience has a direct impact on AI. I think it will eventually as we come to unravel its secrets, but we're probably going to need a lot of AI to help us unravel those circuits before the understanding of those circuits really lets us advance AI, in my personal opinion.
Let me go back a little bit, because a lot of your examples are very extreme examples of things which I think we all experience every day but don't think much of. So anybody who's ever gone on a diet, you say, I'm going to go on a diet, I'm going to lose 20 pounds, I'm going to start today. Well, that works really fine until it gets to dinner time and dinner smells really good, and you sit down and say, well later. Now, wait a minute, what just happened? Did you have one self that decided you're going to go on a diet in the morning, and then another self came in the evening, and the hunger changed the state? Well, what you sort of did, actually, right? We all do this. We're all sort of these contradictions of different desires and different things. So it doesn't strike me as too unusual that under these extreme cases, these disassociations become a little more dominant. Usually we just don't think of this. Sometimes you're one way with your wife, another way with your kids, another way with your students, these three different selves, three different personas. whether we call them personas or selves. I'm not quite sure what the behavioral difference would be.
I like Minsky's notion of society of minds. I mean, maybe not all of the detail implementation, but certainly the metaphor of it. And I think that's right. I think there really is some kind of conflict between different internal agents that have different goals and different access to the steering wheel, so to speak. You might ask when you're building AI whether you actually want to replicate that functionality or whether you maybe want to do it in a different way. So, I mean, humans are notoriously poor at following through on their goals. And we don't want an AI that's so slavish to the human mind that it has trouble on that. I mean, that might be really genuinely scary. You talk about AI risk. The biggest risk of AI is probably systems that don't know how to follow their goals. So you don't want an AI system that's as impulsive as a teenager.
And I guess to take up on Gary's point about, getting inspired by cognitive processes rather than really the nuts and bolts of how neurons are working. I touched upon autism, which tells us a little bit about theory of mind. Now, theory of mind is a subconscious cognitive process, and if we were to understand that, you can imagine designing AI systems that are able to, interface with our theory of mind. We don't have to build a theory of mind into the robot, but at least if it has if it can provide the behavioral cues and all the other cues that we need to feel a certain way towards an artificial system, then you can imagine, and that's being inspired by what we've learned about our cognitive processes, and it's essentially tapping into those in order to instill in us certain feelings as we interact with artificial systems.
I think in the limit, and I slightly disagree with what you said, though not entirely, in the limit, I don't think we're going to ever make machines that can really read open-ended narratives well without having a good theory of our minds. It doesn't mean the machines have to replicate us, but so much of what happens in history and novels and so forth is predicated on the reader or the agents involved having theory of mind. People make the decisions they do because they think they can accomplish their goals or they can't, or they're manipulating other people in certain ways. And so I think if we really want open-ended machine comprehension, which we might well want, we're going to have to
build some
representation of how humans think. That doesn't mean the machines need to think in the same way, right, but it has to be domain knowledge. I might have that domain knowledge for a frog. If I was a nature photographer, I might want to know the habits of the frog in order to get to the right place at the right time. If you're a machine that understands human text, you need to understand why humans do the sometimes silly things that they do.
So, but you still think that the way to super intelligence doesn't have to go necessarily through at least our
through
concept.
Humans? I think I probably should take hints from humans, but I don't think it should be slavish. I mean, like best chess computers don't play like human beings. And there's an argument that the best chess hybrids are human-machine hybrids, but that's a sort of separate question. If you're going to build a machine, you don't do it the way a person does. A person has limited memory. And we don't know how to do the parts that a person does well of the pattern recognition. So they don't need to be identical. Peter Norvig has a nice line about, I don't want to build a replication of human intelligence. I already had 2 of those. I think he had 2. I have two little, a 3-year-old and a 1.5-year-old that are human intelligence. I'm interested in how we build.
It takes a few years, right? 9 months and then...
Well, that is a really interesting question that keeps me up at night. Like, my 2 and 3/4-year-old is way ahead of the best machines in understanding spoken language. I mean, he's very sophisticated. He can put together narratives and understand things over time in a way that machines generally can't. I saw a cartoon recently, which was great, or not a cartoon, but one of these Facebook memes. It says, last year Obama told us he was 53 years old. This year he tells us he's 54 years old. Which is it, Obama? And it's only funny if you realize that certain facts change over time and other facts don't. And if you have a theory about aging and the advancement of time and so forth. If you're just like a deep learning system that memorizes a bunch of facts, you don't get that. And Watson actually has a temporal reasoner and so has a chance at this. Most of the systems out there that are trying to do some NLU don't have that level of biological understanding to be able to make sense of the joke.
Well, presumably super intelligence should be able to simulate a human, right?
That's right. I think it's a prerequisite that it can simulate, at least at an abstract level. I mean, I don't have to know all of the molecular processes of my frog in order to be able to guess, where it's going to go. And if I'm building a system that understands humans, I probably don't need to have a molecularly level faithful simulation. I mean, I can make some guesses about how you would respond if I picked up that bottle and, threw it at you without having to know exactly what your neurons are doing. So, abstraction can be useful, but it needs some sort of simulation there.
Yes. Yes. So let me open the floor for questions. That's Sam? Yes.
Okay, so fascinating discussion. Thank you all, especially, and all the discussion of self is fascinating. In a situation where we think about cognitive systems, so much of the time, whether they're robotics or not, we think of them as having a relatively static set of capabilities, a static set of sensors and effectors. They might change with their knowledge of what we can feed them and train them and what they can learn. But when you think about, and especially when you look at the acquired disabilities that you were talking about earlier with all the different pathologies around self, when we think about cognitive systems that either gain or lose abilities over time, how can we construct, I mean, and some of that could be very positive. Sometimes if something fails, right, the arm doesn't work or the sensor fails, sometimes it can be you just got upgraded and now you have three-dimensional sight, or something like that. How do we build systems like that don't effectively have to have a theory of self where that can modify over time, much like people have to deal with it when our abilities change, either by augmentation or disability?
I would throw that question back at you and say, why do you think that the theory of self is the essential glue for that? So, I mean, I think you can do some of what you're describing without much of a theory of self at all. So there was a paper on the cover of Nature about 2 months ago by Jeff Clune and some others about robots that were able to recover from injuries. And there was no, sense of self there. There was just an algorithm that was able to do some interpolation and so forth. So I think you can get a long way without having a sense of self. I'm not saying you can get all the way to human level self-awareness or something like that, but I think you can have systems that have capacities that go online and offline, that work with things like redundancy, and you can think, look, your phone adds a new skill every time you download an app, and it's fine. There's an ecosystem that allows those apps to communicate with each other, and I mean, I think that's okay. The Google Project Tango is trying to make sort of more, I don't want to call them self-aware phones, but more aware phones that have a lot of sense data about what's going on. I don't think there's like a great philosophical problem to doing that, at least at the initial stages, where you just download a new skill and you've got a new source of data. You've got a model to integrate this set of data and that set of data. I don't think it has to be a big deal, at least until you get to like when your phone starts to wonder, who am I and why am I here? That might be another level.
It's also a slightly semantic issue in the sense that anything that you build does have, I mean, you can conceptualize it as having a self. So if you built a robot, there's a model of the robot, whether it's inside the robot or outside it. And if the arm fell off, the question is, have you built the robot so that it is aware that its arm has fallen off and will go repair itself? Or are you providing that awareness from the outside so that you can repair the arm and upload a new piece of software? I think, the idea that the robot has a boundary, something that has an integrity for it to function the way it needs to, that is the self. It's just a way of thinking about what the self is. In this context, it's just a unit of something that has an integrity, and that integrity should be maintained for it to function appropriately. And if that changes, then something has to figure out that it has gone wrong. And where is that intelligence? Is it inside the robot, outside the robot? So I think that boundary will change as we...
So you're allowing this robot to, in this game of having an awareness of itself?
See, I'm trying to duck that. I'm trying to say, look, my car knows about the tire pressures, and it's got some fancy four-wheel drive system that's very sensitive to how much the wheels are rotating relative to the forces, and it can compensate online. So you could say, if you wanted to, you could say that's the car's representation of itself. It's programmed to adapt pretty well, and it allows it to drive better than an old-fashioned car that didn't have those cognitive systems in it. And if you're satisfied with that being the car's sense of self, then great. And if you want the car to say, well, why am I here? That's a different thing.
Yeah.
So there's a question there?
Question to Gary. So I want you to comment a little bit on another intersection of neuroscience with cognitive systems, which is really studying the embodied self as a quantified self. We all measure ourselves in so many ways now. Previously it used to be just a notional assessment, and now it's actually a quantified assessment. And we do that for all variety of reasons. And that's at the macroscopic level, and that's already available to us, right? So we are actually spewing out this data about ourselves into the universe and quantifying ourselves continuously. And so I want your comment on, with that data, how do we actually go about building an understanding of who that is spewing out all this data? And how do we translate that into a better understanding that a cognitive system would have?
Yeah, I think on the cognitive system side, we're not collecting the right data. I think it's sort of like we're collecting shadows rather than the thing itself. So you can figure out, somebody's personality to some extent from looking at their Facebook posts. So you can, in fact, the more of the posts that they make, probably the more narcissistic they are. I think that's the simpler analyses you can do, and the more friends they have on Facebook. So I think there's some things you can do there. I think that's not directly measuring how the cognitive system works. In this book that you mentioned, The Future of the Brain, it's an edited book. I didn't write it, but I wrote the preface and I wrote the epilogue and a chapter of my own. And the part that's the most fun is Christoph Koch, the neuroscientist who runs the Allen Brain Institute, and I wrote together an epilogue in which we imagined neuroscience 50 years hence. Everything else is much more straight and serious. People are talking about what their labs are doing now and where it might go in the next 10 years. And we got to write this very unbuttoned epilogue in the style of Stanislaw Lem. And we had things in there like, well, maybe 50 years from now, you'll be able to download your brain and make a backup copy, basically. So that would be, a new version of the quantified self if you could make a backup. That would help with some disorders and not others. So if you had a traumatic brain injury and you had a bunch of nanobots, maybe they could reconstruct from that backup, the part of your brain that was damaged. On the other hand, if you had a congenital disorder, it wouldn't help you, because we would, even 50 years from now, we probably won't know enough about how circuitry goes wrong to be able to repair circuitry that was never working in the first place. But the quantified self is just going to get more and more interesting as we can get more and more direct brain measures and start to record something about what makes you you in this self sense.
We have a question here.
I think we talk a lot about how we lose self and how we transfer the self to be another cognitive system. I'm wondering if the panelists can comment on a topic of augmented self, because we are talking about augmented intelligence today. So can we talk about, or it may be in the next book that people would like to write, what is augmented self? Can we talk about how we can leverage cognitive system to make augmented self to make us more intelligent, more confident, more creative, and so on and so forth?
We've been doing that for decades, if not centuries. This is what humans do. When I go to use calculus, I don't have to invent it. 500 years ago, people, if they wanted to plot something like that, they were sort of out of luck. There are 3 people in the world who invented calculus once, as far as we know. And the rest of us learned it. We've been augmented cognition, so we have mathematical skills far superior to anybody before Isaac Newton's times, just as a byproduct of being human and part of the civilization. So we do have lots of augmented cognition and lots of different cognitions. This is what we call learning. This is what we call expertise. Yes.
I mean,
The rubber hand.
there's the rubber hand illusion that I just talked about. That is a very clear indication that you can augment a part of the self that we consider normally immutable, which is our sense of our own body. You can do an experiment. You can wear a top hat, say, really tall one, and keep walking in and out of doors, and you will bend down to avoid hitting the hat on the ceiling. Take off the hat, and for a while you will be unable to prevent yourself from ducking down. And that's because your body maps have adjusted to make you that much taller. And it takes a while for that body map to come back to reflect the fact that you don't have the hat on anymore. What it's telling you is that there are ways in which you can augment your own sense of your body. Neuroprosthetics, just prosthetics like an arm or a leg that you somehow attach. Your brain will incorporate that eventually. So all of that can go towards augmenting yourself in different ways, and in ways that we probably haven't thought of yet.
As a postscript, the first thing you said was about transferring yourself, and there's a lot of interest nowadays in brain uploads, and I would caution anyone planning to undergo that procedure that it probably doesn't transfer yourself. It probably transfers a lot of information about you, and then there's a replica that is not you. And so I don't think selves get transferred. I think information about brains gets transferred, and you can make another brain that's similar, but it's sort of like, is your identical twin you? No. And so I wouldn't put my head in a transporter, and I wouldn't allow myself to have my brain uploaded if it was a destructive process, personally.
Not if there is a fly in the booth.
Say again?
No, if there is a fly in the booth, you don't want
Not
to do
good,
it.
not good.
My question relates to the liability of the actual decision which gets taken when a person is actually collaborating with the agent, which is supposedly having the cognitive capabilities. So one of the criticism or fear you keep hearing about AI and cognitive systems, right, is if there is a error in the software coding and all that stuff. So because of that, I'm actually asking this question: where do you think the liability of the actual decision which gets taken should be? And if the agent that you're building, right, it starts having a model of the self, the individual who is taking the decision, so at what point can the person say, I'm not taking the decision, but someone else is?
Before you answer, we have to wrap up. So this will be the last question that you take.
This seems to me to be a legal and ethical question rather than a scientific question about how you distribute responsibility and so forth. It's not a new question. So, if your car hits somebody, you can try to sue the car manufacturer and say the brakes didn't work, but it's your car and you bought it and you're responsible for it. And I mean, there are lots of places you can look in the existing law that give some guidance. But ultimately, I only feel capable of talking about the scientific question. I don't really have an answer there. I don't know if anyone else wants to touch that one. But.
Nope.
My wimpy answer is the bravest we're going to get on that score.
This clearly looks much more like the beginning of a long discussion than a discussion that can be concluded in any way. So hopefully we'll have many more of these as we make progress. So let me thank the panelists again.
Yes.